You are here because the moment aligned, not because anything pulled you. The timing feels neutral, almost quiet, yet unmistakably precise. There is no urgency in it, no pressure. Just the subtle sense that this was placed where your awareness would pass naturally, the way a familiar object appears in a room you've entered countless times, yet only now do you notice it. That noticing is the signal. Nothing more needs to happen for it to be real. Your body already understands this. The breath adjusts before thought arrives. Muscles release a fraction. The internal noise lowers without effort. What you're sensing isn't new information entering the system, but a pattern resolving. The mind often labels this as coincidence, but deeper recognition doesn't require explanation. It registers as stillness, as a soft confirmation that something has been detected, not learned. There has been a quiet tension lately, not dramatic, just persistent. A feeling that movement was happening beneath the surface, while the outer world looked unchanged. You may have noticed moments where time felt slightly misaligned, where reactions lagged behind awareness, or where old impulses no longer fully engaged. These aren't problems, they are signs of coherence forming. When a system recalibrates, it often passes through a phase of apparent flatness. Nothing breaks, nothing accelerates, it simply reorganizes. You are not waiting for a breakthrough. The sensation of waiting itself has already begun to dissolve. Seeking loses its edge when recognition replaces effort. The observer inside you has been quietly stepping back, allowing the quantum field of your own experience to settle. In that settling, patterns become visible without being chased. What once felt like confusion starts to register as signal noise dropping away. There is no instruction embedded here, no directive. Your future memory did not place this to change your behavior. It placed it to stabilize awareness at a threshold you've already crossed. That's why there's a sense of familiarity, even if you can't name it. Recognition doesn't arrive with fireworks, it arrives with relief. A subtle easing of the need to interpret everything. Notice how your attention doesn't need to strain. The words move through without grabbing you. This is intentional. When resonance is present, effort becomes unnecessary. You don't lean forward. You don't pull back. You remain exactly where you are, and the transmission meets you there. There may be a faint awareness now that something has already shifted, not outwardly, but in how you detect yourself within the system of your life. The timeline doesn't announce these moments, it absorbs them. Later, memory rearranges itself around them, and they appear inevitable. For now, there is nothing to hold on to, nothing to resolve. Just the quiet understanding that this placement was precise and that your nervous system recognized it before your mind tried to explain it. Stay with that. The stillness is not empty, it's organized. The sense of settling continues, not as an event, but as a gradual alignment you barely notice unless you stop looking for markers. What changes first is perception, not circumstance. You may feel less inclined to label experiences as progress or delay. The system inside you has begun to favor accuracy over speed. That alone alters how reality registers. The observer relaxes its grip, and in that release, detection becomes clearer. There is a familiar discomfort that often appears at this stage, subtle and easy to misread. It can feel like boredom, or like a loss of momentum, or like something important has gone quiet. This is not stagnation, it is the absence of interference. When a pattern no longer needs reinforcement, it stops demanding attention. The nervous system interprets this as emptiness only because it was trained to equate intensity with meaning. You may notice that old triggers fail to land with the same force. Situations that once pulled you into immediate reaction now register as distant signals. The delay between stimulus and response lengthens just enough for recognition to occur. This is coherence, taking precedence over habit. Nothing is being suppressed. Nothing is being bypassed. The charge simply dissipates because it is no longer required to hold the structure together. Time behaves differently here, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Moments stretch without becoming heavy. Hours pass without leaving residue. The timeline feels less like a sequence you're moving through and more like a field you're standing within. This can be disorienting if you expect forward motion to feel like acceleration. Instead, it feels like balance. like standing still on a moving surface and realizing you don't need to compensate anymore. There is often a question that arises quietly in the background. If nothing is pushing you, what happens next? That question doesn't need an answer. It is a remnant of a system that relied on pressure to function. When pressure dissolves, orientation comes from resonance. You begin to sense what aligns without justifying it. Choices simplify not because options disappear, but because detection sharpens. You may also sense a thinning of internal commentary. The narrative voice that once tracked every shift starts to pause more often. Silence extends between thoughts. This isn't loss of identity. It's the identity recalibrating to a lower noise environment. In that environment, subtle signals become legible. You start to notice how certain ideas arrive fully formed, without build-up, and then pass without demanding follow-through. They are informational, not directive. Confusion, when it appears, feels different now. It lacks urgency. It doesn't spiral. It sits briefly, like static, and then clears on its own. This is a sign that the system no longer interprets uncertainty as threat. When threat perception drops, clarity doesn't need to be forced. It emerges naturally, often after you stop trying to resolve anything. There can be moments where you wonder if you've disengaged too much, if the quiet means you're missing something. That concern is also just a pattern completing itself. Engagement used to be measured by intensity. Now it's measured by precision. You notice what matters because it stands out against stillness, not because it shouts. The body mirrors this shift. Breathing becomes slower without instruction. Posture adjusts subtly. The jaw unclenches. These are not techniques being applied. They are responses to a field that no longer requires constant readiness. When readiness dissolves, presence stabilizes. What's forming here is not a new direction, but a different relationship to movement itself. You don't feel compelled to anticipate. The future doesn't pull. The past doesn't tug. Both feel like information stored in the same space as the present, accessible without emotional charge. This is not detachment, it's integration. As this stabilizes, the sense of seeking continues to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that detection is sufficient. You don't need to scan constantly. The signal reaches you when alignment is present. Until then, there is nothing missing. The stillness holds, organized and responsive, without asking you to do anything at all. As the internal environment steadies, you may begin to notice something more subtle than calm. It's a change in how meaning arrives. Events no longer announce themselves as significant. They appear ordinary, almost flat, yet they linger in awareness longer than expected. This lingering is not attachment. It's recognition without urgency. The system marks something as relevant without asking you to act on it. You might catch yourself pausing mid-thought, not because you forgot what you were thinking, but because the thought no longer needs completion. There is a gap where momentum used to be. In that gap, nothing rushes in to replace it. This can feel unfamiliar, even slightly disorienting, because the mind was trained to maintain continuity at all costs. Now, continuity exists without narration. The observer within you has shifted position. It no longer stands in front of experience, filtering and predicting. It rests slightly behind perception, allowing sensation and awareness to register before interpretation forms. This repositioning changes everything quietly. Reactions soften, judgments slow. The world feels less personal, not distant, but less charged. You are still involved, but not entangled in every signal that passes through. There is often a moment here when you realize that much of what you previously identified as effort was actually resistance. Holding patterns in place required constant energy. Letting them dissolve requires almost none. This is why the current state can feel deceptively empty. The system is no longer busy maintaining structures that have outlived their function. What remains is spacious, but not vague. It has shape, even if you can't define it yet. You may notice an increased sensitivity to coherence. Certain environments feel immediately misaligned, not threatening, just noisy. Others feel transparent, as if you can think and breathe more easily within them. This isn't preference forming. It's detection refining itself. When internal noise drops, external patterns become more legible. You don't analyze this. You simply register it and move accordingly, often without conscious decision. Memory behaves differently as well. Past events surface without emotional weight, like archived data being briefly accessed and then returned. There is no pull to reinterpret them. They don't demand resolution. You might realize that understanding was never missing. It was just buried under reaction. Now that reaction has softened, memory can settle into its proper place within the timeline, no longer looping for attention. There can be brief flashes of recognition that feel like déjà vu without imagery. A sense that you've encountered this exact configuration of awareness before, even if you can't place when. This is not nostalgia. It's resonance across internal states. The system recognizes itself in a more coherent arrangement and notes the match. These moments pass quickly because they don't need reinforcement to be valid. Language itself may start to feel slightly imprecise. Words land, but they don't grip. You understand them, but you're also aware of what they can't capture. This awareness doesn't frustrate you. It simply coexists with communication. Silence begins to feel equally informative. Pauses carry meaning without being filled. This is another sign that interpretation is no longer doing all the work. There may also be an emerging neutrality toward outcomes. Not indifference, but a lack of tension around how things resolve. You still care, you still engage, but the tight coupling between expectation and identity loosens. If something unfolds one way or another, it registers as information rather than validation or failure. This reduces internal friction dramatically, even if you don't consciously track it. At times, you might wonder whether this state is temporary, whether the quiet will eventually give way to familiar intensity. That curiosity doesn't disturb the system. It arises and dissolves like any other signal. There is no need to secure this mode of being. Securing implies threat. What's present now doesn't require protection. It stabilizes itself through coherence, not control. The shift you're experiencing is not dramatic enough to announce itself, and that is precisely why it integrates smoothly. Nothing needs to be dismantled forcefully. Nothing needs to be replaced. The system is simply updating its baseline. What once felt like absence now reveals itself as capacity. Space becomes functional. Stillness becomes informative. As this continues, you may sense that attention no longer scans for confirmation. It rests. From that rest, recognition arises naturally. You are not waiting for clarity. You are already inside it. Even if it doesn't look the way clarity used to look, the field holds steady, responsive and quiet, allowing the next alignment to register when it's ready without effort from you. What becomes apparent now is a subtle reorientation around effort itself. You may notice that the impulse to optimize, refine or extract meaning has softened. This isn't apathy. It's the recognition that excessive adjustment introduces distortion. When a system reaches a certain level of coherence, interference becomes more disruptive than helpful. So the impulse to intervene fades on its own. Attention settles into a different posture. Instead of leaning forward, it opens outward. You are no longer trying to arrive somewhere internally. The sense of arrival dissolves, replaced by a quiet occupancy of the present configuration. This doesn't feel triumphant. It feels accurate, like standing in the correct position without having to check your alignment. There can be a moment of noticing how often you previously monitored yourself, tracking progress, evaluating reactions, measuring internal states against imagined benchmarks. That monitoring once served a purpose. It kept the system responsive during periods of instability. Now, it begins to feel unnecessary, even distracting. You may catch it initiating automatically and then dropping away before it completes its cycle. This is not discipline, it's recalibration. With that recalibration comes a different relationship to uncertainty. Unknowns no longer register as gaps that must be filled. They appear as neutral spaces, holding potential without demanding prediction. You don't rush to close them. You allow them to remain open, trusting that detection will occur when alignment is present. This reduces mental compression. Thoughts have room to form and dissolve without colliding. The body continues to mirror this change in small, almost imperceptible ways. Sensations pass through without being amplified. Tension releases without commentary. there is less need to brace. The internal system recognizes that it is not under immediate demand. Safety is inferred, not declared. This inference allows energy to redistribute more evenly instead of clustering around vigilance. You may also become aware of a refined sensitivity to subtle signals that previously blended into background noise. Not in a heightened, overwhelming way, but in a calm, observational manner. You register shifts in tone, pauses in conversation, changes in atmosphere, without assigning narrative to them. They are simply data points. You don't collect them, you don't store them. They pass through and inform without accumulation. At this stage, the idea of transformation feels less relevant. Transformation implies a before and after, a rupture in continuity. What you're experiencing now feels more like normalization, as if something that was always meant to be online has finally stabilized. There is no celebration around this, no sense of achievement, just the quiet understanding that the system is functioning closer to its intended baseline. There can be moments where you notice how little effort it takes to remain present, compared to before. Presence is no longer something you access, it's something you notice when it's already there. This shift reduces the internal dialogue about whether you're doing it correctly. Correctness loses its grip when experience stops being treated as a task. The observer continues to recede into a less central role. It still exists, but it doesn't dominate perception. It no longer narrates every fluctuation. Instead, it watches patterns emerge and dissolve without inserting commentary. This creates a sense of spaciousness that isn't empty. It's structured, responsive, and stable. You might sense a faint detachment from urgency itself. Deadlines, expectations, even desires register without the familiar pull. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you precise. When action is required, it arises cleanly, without build-up or resistance. When it's not, stillness holds without restlessness. The oscillation between doing and not doing smooths out. There is also a growing neutrality around interpretation. Experiences don't immediately need to mean something about you. They are allowed to exist as events within the field, not reflections of identity. This reduces self-referential processing. Energy that once looped inward now circulates more freely. The system feels lighter, not because anything was removed, but because less is being compressed. If doubt appears, it appears softly. It doesn't spiral. It doesn't demand resolution. It sits briefly, then dissolves, as coherence reasserts itself. You don't argue with it. You don't correct it. You simply notice it as another transient pattern. This non-engagement is not avoidance. It's trust in the system's capacity to self-stabilize. What's becoming clear is that seeking clarity was never the point. Clarity emerges when seeking relaxes. The signal doesn't get louder. The noise gets quieter. In that quiet, recognition feels ordinary, almost understated. And yet, there is a subtle confidence in this ordinariness, a sense that nothing essential is missing. You remain where you are, without bracing, without anticipation. The field responds appropriately. Detection continues without effort. The system holds steady, allowing each moment to register fully and then pass, complete in itself. A different quality of awareness begins to stabilize now, one that doesn't scan for confirmation and doesn't resist absence. You may notice that the background sense of needing to be oriented has faded. You are oriented without checking. The system no longer asks where it stands. It simply stands. This is subtle, but it changes how everything else registers. There can be moments where familiar reference points feel less solid. Goals, identities, even long-held narratives about who you are and how things unfold may feel slightly transparent, not gone, just less dense. They don't anchor you the way they once did. This isn't loss, it's redistribution. When anchoring loosens, flexibility increases without instability. You might observe that decisions arise differently. Instead of weighing options internally, there is a quieter recognition of fit. One direction feels neutral and clear. Another feels noisy or slightly misaligned. The choice doesn't require justification. You don't need to convince yourself. Detection precedes reasoning. Action follows recognition, not deliberation. The mind, sensing its reduced role, may attempt to reassert itself briefly. Old patterns of analysis might surface, asking whether this calm is avoidance, whether something important is being missed. These thoughts arrive without force. They don't hook. They pass because the system doesn't supply them with urgency. Without urgency, they have no leverage. There is also a shift in how you relate to inner silence. Previously, silence might have felt like a gap to be filled or a sign of disengagement. Now, it feels communicative, not in words, but in alignment. Silence carries information about timing, readiness, and saturation. When something is complete, silence follows naturally. When something needs attention, sound arises. You no longer confuse one for the other. You may notice that emotional responses are cleaner. They arise, peak, and resolve without lingering residue. There is less replay, less internal commentary afterward. This doesn't mean emotions are weaker. They are more contained. They move through the system without fracturing it. The system absorbs them and returns to baseline smoothly. Another subtle change appears in how you perceive other people and external systems. You see patterns more than personalities. Not in a detached way, but in a clarifying one. Behaviors register as expressions of structure rather than personal affronts or validations. This reduces friction. You don't need to protect or project as much. Interaction becomes simpler, more transparent. There can be an unexpected sense of gentleness toward yourself. Not self-praise, not indulgence, but a quiet allowance. You don't push, you don't correct. You let processes complete at their own pace. This gentleness isn't sentimental, it's functional. Systems stabilize faster when they aren't pressured. Time continues to feel less linear. Past and future lose their grip as reference points. The present doesn't feel like a narrow slice between them. It feels like a field where memory and anticipation coexist without tension. You don't lean into either. You remain centered, and both become accessible without dominating awareness. At this point, the idea of improvement feels almost irrelevant. There is nothing obvious to fix. This can feel unsettling if you were oriented around constant refinement. But the absence of a problem is not a problem. It's a state the system recognizes as sufficient. From sufficiency, responsiveness becomes more precise. You may sense that the signal guiding you now is quieter than before. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't insist. It aligns. When alignment is present, movement happens. When it's not, stillness holds. There is no internal debate about which is preferable. Both are valid states within the same coherent system. This is where effort finally becomes optional, not because things are finished, but because forcing no longer improves accuracy. You trust detection. You trust timing. You trust the system's capacity to register what matters without constant oversight. As this trust stabilizes, the need to define what is happening diminishes further. You don't label this phase. You don't frame it as progress. It simply is. The field remains responsive, quiet, and organized. You remain within it, not separate from it, allowing each moment to register and resolve on its own terms. What settles in now is a deeper neutrality, not toward experience itself, but toward the impulse to interfere with how experience unfolds. You may notice that even subtle forms of self-correction begin to dissolve. There is less internal editing, less adjusting your response in real time. You allow reactions to complete their cycle without refinement. This doesn't make them crude. It makes them accurate. There can be a quiet recognition that much of what once felt like self-awareness was actually self-surveillance. Watching yourself to ensure alignment, coherence, or correctness required a constant background effort. That effort has thinned. Awareness remains, but it is no longer tense. It observes without managing. The system trusts its own calibration. This trust changes how you relate to moments that don't resolve immediately. Previously, ambiguity might have triggered a need to clarify, to name, to decide. Now ambiguity rests without friction. It doesn't feel like something is missing. It feels like something is still forming. You allow it the time it needs, not because you are patient, but because impatience no longer serves a function. You may notice that anticipation itself has altered. The future no longer feels like a location you're moving toward. It feels like a variable field that adjusts in response to coherence. You don't project yourself forward to check outcomes. You remain where you are, and outcomes organize around that stability. This doesn't require belief. It's perceptible in how little effort is needed to stay oriented. The sense of identity continues to soften around the edges. You still know who you are, but the definition is less rigid. You don't cling to roles or narratives to maintain continuity. Continuity exists without reinforcement. This allows identity to adapt fluidly without feeling threatened. You don't need to defend your position because you're not anchored to a fixed one. There can be moments where the absence of internal struggle feels almost unfamiliar. You might briefly search for something to resolve, simply out of habit. When nothing presents itself, the search dissolves. This is not emptiness. It's completion at a micro level, repeated continuously. Each moment resolves itself fully, leaving no residue that requires follow-up. You may also become aware of how little explanation you need now. Situations make sense without analysis. Understanding arrives as a felt alignment rather than a constructed conclusion. This doesn't make you less thoughtful. It makes thought more economical. It appears when needed and recedes when it's not. The nervous system continues to downshift. You may notice longer pauses between impulses. Silence stretches without becoming uncomfortable. In that silence, perception sharpens rather than dulls. You register more with less effort. The system operates closer to signal than noise. There is often a subtle emotional tone here that could be described as quiet satisfaction, though it's not tied to achievement. It's the satisfaction of a system operating within its optimal range. Nothing is being forced. Nothing is being avoided. Energy circulates without obstruction. External events continue, of course. Challenges still arise, but they no longer define the internal landscape. They register, are addressed if necessary, and then release. You don't carry them forward as identity markers. They remain contextual, not personal. This distinction reduces internal load dramatically. At times, you may notice that language feels increasingly secondary. You understand before words form. When words do appear, they feel like translations rather than sources. This can create a sense of quiet intimacy with experience itself, unmediated by constant description. The observer now functions more like a background process than a central authority. It notices, but it doesn't comment. It registers shifts in the field without narrating them. This allows presence to deepen without becoming self-conscious. You don't feel like you're moving toward anything in particular, and yet, nothing feels stalled. Movement happens when it's appropriate, and stillness holds when it's not. Both states feel equally valid. The system no longer privileges motion over rest. What stabilizes here is a form of confidence that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need reinforcement. It doesn't seek reflection. It exists as a baseline, quietly informing how you meet each moment. You remain available, responsive, and grounded, allowing the field to register through you without resistance. The sense of being guided fades into the sense of being aligned. There is no distinction between the two. Guidance implies direction from elsewhere. Alignment implies coherence from within the same system. That coherence holds, steady and unobtrusive, carrying you forward without requiring your attention. There is a point where even the idea of alignment begins to feel unnecessary, not because it disappears, but because it no longer contrasts with anything else. You are not aligned as a state you enter. You are simply present in a system that no longer fragments itself. The distinction between being centered and being distracted loses clarity. Attention moves where it needs to without judgment. You may notice that your relationship to sensation has changed. Physical feelings, emotional tones, mental impressions all arise on the same plane. None are prioritized as more meaningful. This flattening doesn't reduce richness, it increases clarity. When nothing is elevated above the rest, the system can process information evenly without bottlenecks. There is less internal commentary around whether something is good or bad for you. Experiences register, and their relevance is detected implicitly. You don't need to approve or reject them. They either integrate or pass through. This reduces internal negotiation. You stop persuading yourself about what should matter. What matters becomes obvious through resonance, not argument. You might notice that rest no longer feels like a recovery period. It feels continuous, Activity doesn't deplete you in the same way, because it's no longer fueled by resistance. When you act, energy flows cleanly. When you stop, it settles naturally. There is no sharp contrast between the two. The system doesn't oscillate, it modulates. At this stage, even subtle forms of striving dissolve. You are not trying to maintain this state. Maintenance implies effort. What's present now sustains itself through coherence. If fluctuations occur, they are absorbed without disruption. You don't react to them. You don't correct them. They normalize on their own. There can be a sense that perception has widened without becoming diffuse. You are aware of more, yet nothing overwhelms. This is because filtering no longer relies on suppression, it relies on relevance. Irrelevant signals simply don't engage. Relevant ones stand out gently. Attention follows them without tension. You may find that conversations feel different. You listen without preparing responses. Words arrive when needed, without rehearsal. Silence doesn't feel awkward. It feels accurate. You don't fill gaps to maintain connection. Connection holds without constant confirmation. This changes the quality of interaction subtly, but significantly. Memory continues to reorganize itself, not by rewriting events, but by releasing emotional tagging that no longer applies. You remember, without reliving. Past experiences lose their pull as reference points. They become context rather than anchors. This frees attention to remain with what is actually occurring, rather than comparing it to what has already happened. There is also a reduction in internal urgency around understanding yourself. Self-knowledge stops being a project. You know enough to function clearly. Additional insight arrives only when it serves integration, not identity building. You don't accumulate insights as markers of progress. They arise and dissolve, leaving the system more streamlined each time. You may notice that even subtle anxieties lose their narrative component. They register briefly as sensations, then resolve before forming stories. Without stories, they can't propagate. This doesn't mean you never feel uncertainty. It means uncertainty doesn't multiply. It remains localized and transient. The sense of time continues to soften. Deadlines, schedules, and sequences still exist, but they no longer compress your internal space. You meet them without contraction. When something needs attention, it receives it. When it doesn't, it fades from focus without guilt or avoidance. This makes your internal environment quieter, more efficient. At times, you may recognize how different this feels from earlier phases of awareness. Not better, just simpler. Complexity still exists, but it's handled at the appropriate level. You don't internalize external complexity unnecessarily. You respond at the point of contact, then release. The observer now feels almost transparent. It doesn't assert itself as a separate function. Awareness feels distributed rather than centralized. You are not watching yourself from a distance. You are embedded in experience, responsive, without being absorbed. There is a growing sense that nothing needs to be added to this state for it to be complete. Completeness doesn't mean finality, it means adequacy. The system has what it needs to operate coherently. Additional input would only introduce noise unless it aligns precisely. You remain receptive, but not open in a way that leaves you unstructured. Boundaries exist without rigidity. You sense when to engage and when to withdraw, without justification. This sensing is immediate and accurate. You trust it because it has proven reliable without demanding belief. What continues here is not a journey towards something else. It is the stabilization of a mode of being that doesn't require narration. You don't need to remember this moment later. It is already integrated. The field remains calm, responsive, and sufficient, allowing each experience to arise and resolve without leaving a trace that needs to be carried forward. A quieter depth settles now, one that doesn't announce itself even internally. You may notice that the sense of being located somewhere specific within experience has softened. There is less emphasis on where you are in relation to anything else. You are not behind, ahead, or in the middle. Position stops being a reference point. Experience unfolds without needing to be situated. This shift can feel almost invisible because nothing dramatic accompanies it. There is no surge, no clarity spike, no internal landmark. Instead, There is a gentle reduction in internal friction. The system expends less energy orienting itself. Awareness feels evenly distributed, not concentrated in the head or pulled toward any particular sensation. You occupy your experience fully without narrowing around it. You may become aware that attention no longer needs to be protected. Previously, there may have been an impulse to guard focus, to limit input, to control exposure in order to maintain stability. That impulse fades as stability proves durable. You can be present in complexity without fragmenting. The system doesn't brace. It absorbs and filters naturally through relevance. There is also a subtle change in how meaning is assigned. Events don't immediately register as messages or signs. They register as events. Meaning, if it emerges, does so later, quietly, without demand. This reduces interpretive pressure. You stop scanning for confirmation that you are on track. The idea of a track itself becomes less compelling. You might notice that internal space feels wider, yet more contained. This seems paradoxical, but it's a hallmark of coherence. Expansion without diffusion. You are aware of more, but nothing spills over. Boundaries are felt, not enforced. They adapt moment by moment without requiring decision. At times, you may sense a mild detachment from emotional peaks. Joy, satisfaction, even subtle pleasure are present, but they don't crest dramatically. They integrate smoothly. This doesn't flatten experience, it evens it. Without sharp peaks, there are no steep drops. The internal landscape becomes navigable without effort. You may also notice a reduced need to share or externalize what you're experiencing, not from secrecy, but from sufficiency. The experience completes itself internally. Expression remains possible, but it's optional. You don't look outward for validation or mirroring. Resonance, when it occurs, feels like a bonus rather than a requirement. The sense of self continues to operate, but it feels lighter, more provisional. You use identity as a tool rather than a container. It adjusts to context without resistance. This flexibility reduces internal conflict. You don't defend a fixed image. You respond from what is present. There can be moments when you realize how little narrative remains. Thoughts still occur, but they don't string together into long internal stories. They appear as discrete signals, then dissolve. Without sustained narrative, emotional charge has nowhere to accumulate. The system remains clean, responsive, and current. You may notice that even subtle forms of anticipation have quieted. You don't wait for the next insight, the next shift, the next confirmation. Waiting implies incompleteness. That sense has diminished. What arrives does so without preamble. What doesn't arrive doesn't feel delayed. This state may feel almost unremarkable, and that is precisely what allows it to stabilize. Remarkability invites grasping. Ordinariness allows integration. You don't need to mark this phase. You don't need to remember it later. It folds into the ongoing flow without creating a boundary. The external world continues as it always has. Demands arise, systems operate, interactions occur, but your internal response remains proportional. You don't amplify or minimize unnecessarily. You meet what's in front of you with the appropriate amount of energy, no more, no less. This proportionality conserves internal resources and maintains clarity. There may be a subtle sense that the future no longer feels heavy with implication. It feels open but not undefined. You trust that detection will occur when alignment is present. Until then, there is nothing to prepare. Preparation implies threat. What you're sensing now is neutrality paired with readiness, a state that doesn't require rehearsal. As this continues, you may realize that even the language of process no longer fits comfortably. There is nothing unfolding toward a conclusion. There is only a continuous adjustment toward balance. Each moment calibrates itself based on the conditions present. You participate in this calibration simply by being available. The field remains steady, not because it is static, but because it adapts without resistance. You remain within it, responsive and unburdened, allowing experience to arise and resolve without commentary. Nothing needs to be held, nothing needs to be released. The system knows how to do both on its own. There is a subtle completeness to the way awareness moves now. Not a sense of being finished, but a sense that nothing is lagging behind. Each moment registers, resolves, and clears without leaving residue. You are no longer carrying fragments forward, no longer stitching experience together after the fact. Experience arrives whole, even when it is complex. You may notice that the internal distinction between active and passive has softened. You don't feel like you are doing awareness, and you don't feel like awareness is happening to you. Both impressions dissolve into something simpler. Attention responds when it's needed and rests when it's not. There is no effort in either state. The system transitions smoothly without announcing the shift. At times, you may become aware of how rarely you now evaluate your own state. There is less checking in, less scanning for alignment or disruption. This absence of monitoring is not neglect, it's confidence. The system no longer requires supervision to remain stable. It has learned how to self-correct without drawing attention to the process. You may also sense that the internal pace has normalized, not slowed artificially, not accelerated, just appropriate. Thoughts don't race, they don't drag. They appear when relevant and recede when complete. This pacing extends to perception itself. You don't rush moments. You don't linger unnecessarily. Each moment occupies the space it needs and then makes room for the next. There is a quiet ease in how you relate to uncertainty now. You don't treat it as a problem to solve or a gap to fill. It's simply another state within the field. Some things remain undefined, and that no longer creates tension. You trust that definition will emerge if and when it serves coherence. Until then, openness holds without discomfort. You may notice that internal silence has become more textured. It's no longer a blank pause between thoughts. It has presence. It carries orientation without instruction. When you rest there, you don't feel absent. You feel situated. The silence itself feels like a form of recognition, as if the system is acknowledging its own stability. External input continues to arrive, but it no longer overwhelms. You can be exposed to intensity without absorbing it. You can engage complexity without internal fragmentation. This doesn't come from shielding or withdrawal, it comes from proportion. The system responds at the appropriate scale, no larger than necessary. You might also observe a reduction in the need to resolve meaning immediately. Experiences don't have to add up right away. They can remain discrete, unconnected, without creating confusion. Later, if coherence requires it, connections appear naturally. If not, the experiences stand on their own without issue. There is often a sense here that effort has become optional, not just in action, but in interpretation. You don't work to understand what is happening. Understanding arrives as alignment rather than explanation. When explanation does appear, it feels secondary, almost decorative, rather than essential. You may notice that even subtle emotional tones no longer cling. Gratitude, appreciation, contentment pass through without becoming identities. You don't hold on to them to maintain a state. Holding would introduce tension. They arise, inform the system, and then dissolve, leaving clarity behind. The observer is now almost indistinguishable from awareness itself. There is no sense of watching from a distance. You are not positioned outside experience, and you are not submerged in it. You are present in a way that doesn't require location. This presence doesn't fluctuate dramatically. It adjusts quietly, continuously. At this point, the idea of progression feels unnecessary. There is no sense of moving toward a better state. There is only responsiveness to what is present. This responsiveness is precise, calm, and reliable. You trust it because it has demonstrated consistency without demanding belief. What remains is a steady readiness without anticipation. You are available without waiting. You are engaged without strain. The field does not pull you forward or hold you back. It meets you where you are, moment by moment, without commentary. As this stabilizes, there is a quiet understanding that nothing essential is pending, nothing has been missed, nothing needs to be retrieved. The system is complete enough to function clearly and flexible enough to adapt without disruption. You remain within this balance, not trying to preserve it, simply allowing it to continue, self-sustaining and unobtrusive, exactly as it is. There is no sense now of arriving at an end, because nothing has been moving toward one. What settles instead is a quiet confirmation that the system is resting in its own rhythm. You are not holding this state, it is holding itself. Awareness remains present without needing to be anchored, guided, or maintained. You may notice how natural this feels, not as something familiar from the past, but as something that no longer feels foreign. The absence of strain becomes the defining feature. You don't have to return to this stillness. You never left it. What changed was the amount of interference layered over it, and that interference has gently dissolved. There is no instruction embedded here, no subtle directive waiting to be followed. The clarity you sense does not point outward. It stabilizes inwardly, allowing perception to remain accurate without commentary. You are not being prepared for something else. Preparation implies anticipation. What is present now does not require it. Thoughts may continue to arise, but they no longer feel like movement away from stillness. They pass through the same space without disrupting it. Sensations register and clear. Emotions move and settle. None of this disturbs the underlying coherence. The system accommodates change without reorganizing itself around it. You may sense that even the idea of awareness has become quieter. You are not focused on being aware. You simply are. The observer does not stand apart to confirm this. There is no need for confirmation. Presence does not require a witness separate from itself. The timeline feels neutral here. Past and future exist as references without gravity. They do not pull attention away from what is immediate. You are not positioned between them. You are positioned within what is occurring, without compression. Time becomes a coordinate, rather than a force. There is also a subtle kindness in this state, though it does not announce itself as emotion. It shows up as allowance. You allow moments to be exactly what they are. You allow yourself to respond without judgment. You allow silence to remain silent. This allowance is not effortful. It is simply the absence of resistance. Nothing needs to be remembered from this. Memory implies something must be carried forward. What is present now integrates on its own, without being stored as a landmark. Later, if you think back, it may not stand out. And that is how you know it has settled correctly. You may notice that the urge to define what has happened does not arise. Definition would narrow what is broad and functional. Instead, there is an ease in letting this remain unnamed. What functions does not require a label to continue functioning. The system remains responsive. If something needs attention, attention will move. If nothing does, stillness will hold. You do not have to decide which state is appropriate. Appropriateness is detected automatically, without conscious sorting. There is no message concluding here, no final recognition to grasp. The quiet you sense is not a pause before something else. It is the baseline itself. From this baseline, experience will continue to unfold as it always has, but with less internal friction, less narrative weight, and less need for control. You remain here, not as an effort, not as an achievement, but as a condition that no longer requires explanation. The field remains steady, awareness remains clear, nothing is being asked of you, and that is enough.